Hello, hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Welcome back to, I think this is the third video in our sequence for this advanced Spanish grammar course. In this video, in this little mini video lesson, what I'm going to do is talk about some of the grammar structures and functions that I find to be most challenging for L2 learners or Spanish students. Okay, so our overview, what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give a little bit of background about why I picked these structures. Then we're going to go through, I think I've picked 8 of them. First one has to do with expressing equivalents of to be in Spanish. Second, using the proper past tense, choosing between the preterite or the imperfect. Then we'll move on to indicative versus subjunctive verb mood. We'll talk about that pesky little particle se, which shows up in so many constructions in Spanish. Talk about prepositions, right? Knowing which preposition to use and when you need to use one. Also talk about adjective placement, because what's problematic there is that sometimes an adjective might come before a noun. Talk about relative pronouns and articles, in particular definite articles. So those are the topics. Then I'm going to just give a brief list of some other structures and functions that I think are challenging for L2 learners of Spanish. And then I'm going to give you guys some tips about resources you can check out for further study. So without further ado, why these structures? Well, the topics that I'm going to feature in this video are grammar structures and functions that learners of Spanish seem to have the most trouble producing accurately, right? And so these are things that I've noticed in my 20 plus years. I know I look younger than that, right? But in my 20 plus years of teaching Spanish and also translation. In fact, I first developed this presentation, Challenging Grammar Structures, for a group of translators, right? And I gave it a translation conference. But it came out of what I'd seen in my translation classes. Another thing about these structures is that although they're advanced, so if you have a Spanish textbook, they tend to be at the end of the book or at the end of the second or third book. A lot of them are actually very high frequency and they're needed to do even simple tasks. These are the types of structures and functions that even people who are fairly proficient, who can speak fluently and relatively accurately, still haven't mastered, right? They separate the real, and excuse the sexist expression, they separate the real men from the boys in Spanish learning, or the women from the girls, okay? A lot of these challenges, I think, as I look at them, and the reason it came up in a translation context, are things that result from differences in English L1 and Spanish L2 grammar patterns. In general, English grammar is a pretty good fallback when you're trying to figure out how to say something structurally in Spanish. But these are the types of topics where falling back on your English, if that's your L1, won't help you very much. And that's what causes some of these challenges. Another thing is, these tend to be things where it's really hard to ascertain patterns and to make generalizations on the input, right? And so as a result, I think as compared to some simpler structures, right, regular present tense verbs or basic sentence structure, word order, rules for these types of structures and functions are always suspect. There tend to be a lot of exceptions, and so you might find very different rules and notice that, wow, these don't really work for me. This set of rules doesn't really work for me. There's so many exceptions, right? Another reason that I think it's worthwhile just to know these topics is that sometimes as second language learners, we don't know what we don't know, right? We may think, hey, I'm doing this right. I'm awesome. I'm perfect. But if you think about these 8 topics, I think you might realize that you're really making some mistakes here. We have some blind spots as non-native speakers, as L2 learners. And I think that knowing what the issues are can help us as learners to focus our attention and our study time, and also helps instructors to know where students struggle. Even those advanced, more proficient students will struggle with all of these topics. These are regular error patterns for L2 learners of Spanish. In this video, I'm not actually going to provide instruction. I'm just going to talk about what the topics are. And one of the reasons is we don't have time. Second reason is I've already recorded videos on my YouTube channel, right? Just Google Professor Jason Spanish. I've already recorded excellent, if I do say so myself, videos on all of these topics except for the last topic, articles. Okay? Let's move on to the first topic, and that has to do with expressing equivalents of to be in Spanish. So, what's the problem? Well, L2 learners of Spanish often use the wrong verb in Spanish when they're wanting to say things like I am, she is, we are, they were, he was, etc. And the problem is that there are several Spanish verbs used to represent these depending on what the meaning is, right? What the function is. So we have obviously the verb ser, as in ellos son profesores, they are. The verb estar in a sentence like las ventanas están, I forgot to change, there's a typo, it should say las ventanas están abiertas, were. The verb haber, impersonally, right? So there are many people at the beach, there were many people at the beach. Again, if you're thinking with your English, your L1, right? Are, were, it might not occur to you that it's haber, I, or había. And then sometimes tener can also be an equivalent of forms of to be in English, right? We are all hungry. Todos tenemos hambre. So I've put those equivalents of the verb to be just to sort of reiterate that you have a very, if you're thinking in English, they're forms of the verb to be, right? But we're using 4 different verbs in Spanish. That makes it hard for learners. Moving on, that one you're probably aware of. Another one that a lot of instructors and students know that folks struggle with is the distinction between the preterite or the imperfect. What's the problem? Well, L2 Spanish learners often don't know which past tense to use, right? When narrating or describing past actions or conditions, Spanish speakers use different tenses to mark actions as completed, preterite, or ongoing, right? Or repetitive in the past, imperfect. So English speakers learning Spanish seem to struggle with determining aspect, maybe because it's not always marked in the same way. And here are just some examples, right? Where you can see the Spanish verb, right, declensions or the verb tenses, endings are different, right? Clearly marking aspect. Whereas in English, the same form is used. Mi padre volvió temprano ayer, pero trabajó mucho, versus mi padre volvía tarde cuando trabajaba en la mina. In English, both, right, volvió and volvía are represented by the simple past, came home, or what looks like the simple past, right? We also have aspect in the past in English, so one of them technically is preterite and one of them is imperfect, right? But the forms are the same, and that's where the confusion comes from, right? So trabajó, trabajaba. In English, they're both worked in this particular sentence, right? English has other ways of marking this, such as saying something like was working or used to work, right? Those would be imperfect. She was tired. Ella estaba muy cansada. Or estuve enfermo, right? I was sick all last weekend. But in English, same form, right? Estuve en español. Vivió peligrosamente y tuvo varios accidentes. Okay, that's our preterite example. Versus viví en Chicago cuando tenía 15 años, right? I was living, or I lived in Chicago when I was 15. So again, the same forms in English for 2 different forms in Spanish. That can cause confusion. So preterite versus imperfect. Moving on to the third difficulty, that's knowing whether or not to use the subjunctive. So the problem is that as L2 learners of Spanish, we don't always know when to use the subjunctive, right? Spanish speakers use different forms to indicate indicative and subjunctive verb moods. And this is a choice that's conditioned by at least 2 things, right? There has to be a certain syntactic structure and there have to be certain semantic features, right? There has to be a certain type of meaning being expressed. So knowing when to use subjunctive forms is challenging for English speakers because, once again, English does not always or often mark this distinction, right? It's sort of disappeared as a distinct verb form in English. So we still have the subjunctive mood, it's just not necessarily marked verbally. So, like I said, to use the subjunctive, it requires a specific sentence structure. You have to have a main and a subordinate clause, usually with different subjects for both clauses, and you have to be expressing certain types of meaning. You can read them on the slide. Like I said, the purpose of this lesson is not to provide a bunch of instruction on these topics, but just to point them out. Also, another complicating factor is that with the subjunctive, you have sequence of tense issues, right, to keep those clauses parallel, and that can also be very difficult for second language learners. Okay. All right, so obviously the subjunctive versus indicative is a major problematic area for anyone who's learned Spanish or Portuguese. Uses of the particle se. What's the problem? Well, Spanish L2 learners often struggle with the multiple uses of se, and that's because, as you've probably noticed, right, the particle se has many frequent uses and functions in Spanish, and it seems to pop up everywhere, right? So as learners, we just have trouble keeping all these uses straight and also producing them accurately. So and I do have a very detailed YouTube lesson on the particle say, which other people have actually copied, right? So if you want to go onto YouTube and just look up Professor Jason uses of particle say, you'll find this complete lesson. But at least 5 different uses, right? You have say in reflexive or reciprocal constructions. You have passive say constructions, right? You have the impersonal se come bien en España, se habla español, right? Se dice que, right? Se sabe que. You have say as an indirect object pronoun when it precedes a direct object pronoun that starts with an L sound, right? So I'm going to submit it to him or to them. Se lo voy a entregar. And then no fault, so-called no fault say constructions, right? Like instead of saying you left your keys at home, you could say se te quedaron en casa, or we ran out of gas, se nos acabó la gasolina. Okay, so the problem with say is just that there's so many uses to keep straight, right? Moving on to prepositions, extremely problematic area, right? The words are simple, words like a, con, de, en, por, para, right? Cerca de, okay? The problem is knowing when to use them, right? So Spanish learners often don't know when prepositions are needed or which ones to use for that matter. So since the use of prepositions, another complicating factor is that the use of prepositions, and you know this if you've ever learned a second, third, or fourth language, the use of prepositions varies among languages, right? There are a lot of them, so knowing which one to use in Spanish when you're thinking in English, right? When you're going from English as your L1 to Spanish as your L2 is a challenge. And really it's a challenge that can take a lifetime to master. You can listen to people that will get advanced or superior or C2 on the Common European Framework, right? Doing an oral or a written assessment, but you'll still find mistakes in their preposition use. It's just something that it takes a lifetime to master. So what are the problems? In a nutshell, right? Some English preposition uses correspond to those of their most direct Spanish counterparts. So sometimes translation works. Oh, to is often a, right? Of is often de, right? In is or on are often en. With is usually con. So that usually works, right? But an English preposition may have many Spanish equivalents, right? So there might be lots of ways to say to or lots of ways to say from. And the opposite is also true, right? There might be lots of English equivalents for para, right? So keep that in mind. Of course, many verbs in Spanish require prepositions after them to link them to what comes next, right? Examples would be insistir en, dejar de, aprender a. And of course, this is true with English as well, right? So in Spanish you have enseñar a, to teach someone to do something, right? So in English this is true too, but oftentimes, next bullet point, right? Those prepositions don't correspond to what you would expect. So for example, to dream about something in English, that takes a preposition about. It takes a preposition in Spanish as well, soñar con. But the prepositions don't match in our minds, right? About, we don't usually equate that with con, right? Or to count on, contar con. So the preposition might be different, even though both verbs require prepositions. And then sometimes one language will require a preposition where the other language doesn't, or vice versa. So in English we say to look for. In Spanish we just say buscar. We don't say buscar por or buscar para. It's just buscar, no preposition. Okay. So there's a lot of phrasal verbs in English, right? If you're familiar with English grammar, there's a lot of phrasal verbs. There aren't phrasal verbs in Spanish. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, which is adjective placement. Well, I thought adjective placement was simple, right? In Spanish, adjectives come after nouns. La Casa Blanca, the famous example, right? You don't say la blanca casa, you say la Casa Blanca. Okay, so the problem is that L2 learners of Spanish are unsure when adjectives can come before nouns, okay? So we're taught as students that adjectives usually follow nouns in Spanish, but we have a difficulty developing a sense for when adjectives sound more natural before nouns, okay? Sorry, I'm distracted. There's some birds flying out there. Also, some Spanish adjectives, when they come before or after a noun, their meaning changes slightly. So here's some examples, right, of the typical pattern that we learned as the basic rule, right? Place your adjective after the noun. Nuestro supervisor es una persona agradable, right? Persona is the noun, agradable is the adjective, right? Or his retirement or her retirement, right, party was a very well attended event. Fue un evento muy concurrido. Again, the adjective and the adverb after the noun, right? Evento is the noun. But in the next three examples, right, are examples in which to express this idea, right, it sounds much better putting the adjective before the noun. The problem is, why? And I'm not going to go into that in this video, okay? So, something to look up. Los paparazzi no dejaron en paz a la famosa modelo, right? A la famosa modelo, right? Assuming we know who we're talking about, right? So we're talking about one of the Kardashians, Kendall, right? Or Kylie, right? No dejaron en paz a la famosa modelo en París, right? El concierto va a ser en el hermoso Parque Chapultepec, la Ciudad de México. Adjective noun. El doctor Campos es un gran profesor, right? El doctor Campos es un gran profesor de sintaxis, okay? Gran profesor means he's a great, marvelous, amazing professor, right? Profesor grande means something else, okay? So, when to put adjectives before nouns? Again, a topic to look up in your favorite grammar book. All right, relative pronouns, okay? L2 learners of Spanish often don't know, number one, what a relative pronoun is, right? When to use one, and then which one to use, because there are several. So, most of the time, right, Spanish uses que or quien, but there are compound forms like el que, or la que, or los que, los cuales, right? And those are used sometimes in speech, but typically in more formal types of speech and writing. So, although English has similar types of relative pronouns, we have that, we have which, we have who, right? We have whom, we have about which, things like that. We have similar forms, right? Still, for some reason, L2 learners of Spanish often struggle to choose and use the right forms. So here are some examples, right? And a little bit of commentary on why it's tricky, right? So the meeting we had yesterday, la reunión que tuvimos ayer, right? The meeting we had yesterday. One reason this is tricky, even the use of que, is that in Spanish it's required. This relative pronoun que here is required. La reunión que tuvimos ayer, right? But in English it's not. I can say the meeting that we had yesterday, or just the meeting we had yesterday. So again, there's a disconnect between the English pattern, right, and the Spanish pattern. The meeting about which, right, the meeting I spoke to you, the meeting about which I spoke to you, right? La reunión sobre la cual. So here we have to use a compound form, either la que or la cual. We can't use que. Why? I'm not going to go into it in this video, but I do have 2 videos on YouTube about relative pronoun use, okay? Or with a person, right? Oh, with a person you should always use quien, right? Wrong, right? El director que votó en contra, the board member, right? El director que votó en contra, the board member who voted against. Here we're using que, and in fact it has to be que. This third example you could not say quien, right? However, in the fourth example you can. El director a quien conocimos ayer, right? But you could also say al cual or al que, right? So why is that? When can you use which? It's very tricky, and again, I have a couple of videos on this on YouTube. Finally, articles, right? When to use or when to omit. The problem is that L2 learners of Spanish often don't know when an article is required, but English might not, and when that article is omitted, but in English you might need it, right? So that's the tricky thing, is that there are many hard to predict discrepancies between Spanish and English use of articles, particularly definite articles. So again, this topic goes along with the theme of sort of translation or relying on L1 structures, right, to help you with your L2, and when that breaks down. This is one of those whens, okay? So again, Spanish sometimes requires articles where English does not, and vice versa. So for example, some examples. ¿Te gusta el helado? ¿Te gusta el helado? Okay, if you're a fairly proficient speaker of Spanish, you know that's the way you say it, right? Do you like ice cream? But notice it's not the ice cream, right? It's just, do you like ice cream? Okay. Where's the article in English? Don't need it, shouldn't use it, right? Spanish, have to have it. Why? I'm not going to go into it. And in fact, this is one topic, articles, when to use, when to omit, that I have not created a YouTube video about because it's so complicated. It would take me months to even write the script for the video. Not interested. Sorry, you're on your own. There's lots of great grammar books out there. Tengo una cita con la doctora Jimenez. No article in English. I have an appointment with Dr. Jimenez, right? But if I'm speaking directly to that person, I omit the article. ¿Estás bien, doctora Jimenez? Right? Or how about my arms hurt? That's a possessive in English. My arms hurt. But in Spanish, I use the definite article. Me duelen los brazos. Okay? Just throwing random uses of articles at you so you can see that it is a complicated topic. Or in English, right? We study, another typo, I apologize. We study on Tuesdays, right? Estudiamos los martes. Direct, definite article used, right? Okay. So, those are the 8 that I consider extremely difficult even for fairly proficient and fluent speakers of Spanish, right? They will still have systematic patterns of error with those 8 structures. I guarantee it, right? You can be an advanced high, you can be a C2, you can be a superior, and you're going to make the occasional mistake in those areas, okay? All right, a few other things that I think are challenging, maybe for more like intermediate level students, right? Students who are moving up the proficiency spectrum, are passive voice constructions using ser in the past participle. For example, la novela fue escrita por Carlos Fuentes. Knowing when to conjugate verbs and when you can leave a verb unconjugated. There are several constructions or rules, right? Situations that involve not conjugating infinitives. Using double object pronouns, so things like me las, te lo, right? Nos, lo, things like that can be tricky. Comparisons, this is an easier formulaic thing to learn, but a lot of people still make mistakes. Producing comparisons of equality and inequality, right? For example, mi hermana es tan inteligente como mi hermano, right? Or mi profesor, escribe tan bien como, right? Mi papá, whatever. And superlatives, right? Producing if-then constructions. Most of these topics, by the way, I do have YouTube videos. If-then constructions, right? So saying things like, si llueve mañana, vamos a cancelar, right, la fiesta. Okay, that's a probable, right, fact one. What about something hypothetical, right? Si lloviera, or something contrary to fact, right? Si hubiera llovido, so they get tricky in terms of the verb, the sequence of tenses and things like that. Temporal expressions using hace or hacía que, right? So to say something like, I've been doing something since, or I've been doing something for so long, using those formulaic expressions. And then just simply knowing when to use written accents, right? The tilde, the accent mark, other diacritics, punctuation. Not necessarily a grammar, more a mechanics of writing topic, but students still struggle with that. Okay? All right, and then finally I want to point out some great resources for further study. Of course, you have Professor Jason's grammar playlist on YouTube. That's a great one that I always recommend.
Just because
Oh, sorry about that. It's going to show a group on... there's my channel. Okay, let's go back here. Where are we? Excuse me as I toggle. Okay, Spanish grammar and context guides. This is one of my favorites. I mean, these are excellent. So let me show you that website. This is by, I believe it's the University of Texas. Let's see. Yes, the University of Texas at Austin. I mean, here are the topics. Really excellent articles on each, right? For example, common prepositions, and then there are examples, rules, explanations, things like that. I mean, this is an amazing website, so kudos to the guys at, guys and gals, everybody, I meant to be inclusive, at the University of Texas, okay? Spanish proficiency exercises by Dr. Orlando Kelm, right? Great guy. Have met him in person, just really dedicated to language teaching, advancing knowledge about the profession. These are amazing. What this is this is a collection of, also from the University of Texas, Austin, right? A collection of native speakers who perform different tasks, right? And usually have a variety. So if I look at intermediate, your favorite restaurant, there are 5 to 6 different native speakers, and there's a video, and you can see the transcript. So you're really seeing how lexis is combined with syntax, right, and phonology, and all of those aspects of language by people who speak different dialects. It's just a fantastic resource. Okay. These reference pages on different Spanish topics by Dr. Fred, I think his last name is pronounced, Jehle. Hang on a second, I apologize. There you go here. All right. They're really excellent. He's retired. He's been retired for like 15 years, but he gave me permission to promote these pages that have stayed up. They're just excellent, excellent, very traditional, explicit definitions of grammar, but they are spot on. In fact, many of to give Fred due credit, many of the grammar explanations I present in my videos are variations on. I always consult his work. Okay. What else? Let me see. Sorry. Also, these grammar articles at thoughtco.com. Okay. This formerly was about.com, and these articles are really second to none. They're superb. So for example, Introduction to Using Spanish Prepositions. Most of this content was written by Gerald Erickson, another person right up there with Fred, who I just talked about, and Orlando, who are just amazing in their explanations. So I've also talked to Gerald before and gotten his permission to promote his really excellent work. Okay, so that's why these guys are on my short list here. And then of course some of the official sites put out by the Real Academia Española. You have the Diccionario panhispánico de dudas. Here you can search for topics that might be problematic, right? So for example, subjuntivo, or even, se. I don't know what'll come up. I've never searched for it here. But if there's any tricky use, it will explain it. Okay. All right. And let's go back to the last one. The last I just have here, is the, what happened? Bear with me here. It's just that Nueva gramática de la Real Academia Española. So this is a great reference resource that you can also, I don't believe you can consult this one online, unfortunately, but a lot of the tools and dictionaries provided by the Real Academia are searchable. Okay. All right, well that's it for this lesson, meant to be just an overview of the challenging grammar structures. Again, like I said, as language learners, sometimes we have blind spots, and this will help us to be more aware of perhaps where to focus our attention, but I think it's also helpful for instructors to know, and a lot of us do know, and many of you who are instructors will know this information, but what our learners struggle with. So that's it for today's lesson, challenging grammar structures in Spanish. Thanks a lot for your attention.